Hello Internet, welcome to All Things Canadia, the Canadian show not about hockey. My name is Yusuf Hanna and today we're going to talk about Canada, specifically energy and the environment. I'm pretty passionate about the environment, so forgive me if I'm a little bit more critical than usual. If I was going to do this video on cut, you'd hear me curse, so every time I would be cursing, I'll be replacing it with the name of a Canadian politician. Insert needless transition here. Environmentally, Canada is moderate at best. Canada's huge, it has a lot of land and a lot of trees, and it should be a carbon sink. So we have a current government that, for some reason, hates democracy. Besides the whole election fraud thing, they've been passing these things called omnibus bills, which basically means that they put a whole bunch of measures in a single bill and pass it in the House of Commons without debate. The one in question here is Bill C-38, which changes or replaces at least 6 acts of Parliament relating to the environment in the name of jobs, growth, and prosperity. Okay, quick summary of greenhouse gases. According to Environment Canada, greenhouse gases trap heat in the Earth's atmosphere. These gases prevent heat from escaping just as the glass of greenhouse keeps warm air inside. Human activity increases the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, contributing to a warming of the Earth's surface. That warming would help melt the polar ice caps, raising sea levels, and potentially sinking coastal areas, which would be a big deal. That part's mine. The most common greenhouse gases emitted are sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide. So it should come as a surprise then that Minister of the Environment and Head of Environment Canada, Peter Kent, announced in 2012 that Canada would withdraw from the Kyoto Protocol. Canada had committed to decrease greenhouse gas emissions by 6% from the 1990 baseline level, which would be 553 megatons per year. Canada is now at 692 megatons per year, which you will recognize is nowhere near 553 megatons per year. In fact, it's a 25% increase. But if we take a closer look, like a 30-second Google search closer, we can get a better idea of why the current government, and I'm sugarcoating this here, wants to Diefenbaker the environment. Let me read you an excerpt of a letter from Stephen Harper in 2002, then leader of the Canadian Alliance Party. We're gearing up for the biggest struggle our party has faced since you entrusted me with the leadership. I'm talking about the Battle of Kyoto. Our campaign to block the job-killing, economy-destroying Kyoto Accord. Job-killing, economy-destroying Kyoto Accord. This man is the Prime Minister of Canada. He goes on in the letter to say that climate change science is based on tentative and contradictory scientific evidence about climate trends. The government has since reversed its obnoxious position on climate change denial, but has done exactly Mulroney about it. In fact, in the first year of the current Prime Minister, carbon dioxide emissions increased dramatically. Carbon dioxide, by the way, is one of the biggest greenhouse gases that we've been trying to handle because it has a large role in ozone depletion. Oh yeah, and it isn't one of the pollutants Environment Canada, a shell of what it once was, bothers to measure under the current government. Virtually every party except the Conservative Party of Canada, as well as a number of nonpartisan groups, suggests or suggested a carbon tax to prevent emissions. These groups, predictably, had their funding cut or eliminated by the Harper government. Since the federal government has done exactly Mackenzie, Ontario has ordered the phasing out of coal-powered power plants and passed cap-and-trade legislation. Cap-and-trade is basically setting a limit on carbon dioxide emissions and forcing companies to trade carbon credits worth money based on current emissions. In addition, Ontario has put into place some funding for expanding the public transportation system. Quebec also capped emissions and joined the carbon credit system, along with Manitoba and British Columbia. Now, I can't put all of the blame on the federal government. See, the provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan have over half of the world's bitumen, which can be converted into oil. 1.3 million barrels of oil are produced from the Athabasca oil sands alone every day. Now, this accounts for a great source of revenue for those provincial governments, as well as for the federal government. But unfortunately, mines don't only bring out oil. The bitumen is located under and around the Athabasca River in northern Alberta that flows into the Athabasca Lake. The river is being contaminated daily by waste from the mines, including such toxins as mercury, lead, and arsenic. The Athabasca River Delta is the largest freshwater delta in the world, but it won't be fresh water for long, with an approximate 1 billion cubic meters of waste by 2020. There have also been claims that are being studied of a higher than normal incidence of cancer in areas around the oil sands. There are 2 proposed pipelines out of the oil sands. The first pipeline, and the more famous, is the Keystone XL pipeline that would lead across the border into the United States through huge parts of the central United States. The environmental hazards are, needless to say, huge. First of all, it runs through aquifers. However safe you might want to build it, Murphy's Law still prevails, and you get a dirty aquifer. Then there's a whole bunch of other issues with it, and it takes jobs away from Canada, but hey, it helps sell Canadian oil, which actually isn't Canadian oil, it's Canadian corporate oil. The second pipeline is the Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline that would run west to the coast of British Columbia, possibly opening the door to oil trade with the Pacific Rim. That one is being promptly refused by the BC government because of the environmental implications, which are many, but Enbridge is still working on a comprehensive plan. This conveniently segues us to the idea of energy. Canada is one of the world's leading producers in energy production, accounting for about 6% of world output. Canada is the leader in uranium mining, which we shouldn't be proud of because of the bad rap uranium has been getting, but it's actually really important for nuclear power plants, which Canada has. And it's also the leading producer of hydroelectric power, and is the leading producer of petroleum, natural gas, and coal. Energy production and transportation is regulated by the National Energy Board, which used to have a lot of power, but then it was gutted by the current government. No biggie, don't start freaking out yet, or else you'll flip Borden by the end of the video. So first on the docket is coal. Alberta sits on a literal bedrock of coal, and there are significant deposits everywhere, Canada having the 10th largest reserve of coal in the world. You'll remember, of course, Canada is clarking huge. You'll also note coal has never been the most popular form of energy because of its inefficiencies and environmental concerns. Coal has significant sulfur content that's released into the air, and that's bad for people who, intend to breathe. Nevertheless, steel mills and the for some reason still existing thermal power plants use coal. Second on the docket, petroleum. Alberta is also huge on petroleum production. The biggest thing to note is that in the 1970s there was a huge energy crisis, and I mean huge. There were a whole bunch of wars and revolutions in Arab states, and oil became super expensive. Inflation was also on the rise, and as it stood, oil went from $3 to $36 a barrel. In order to deal with this, in 1980, Pierre Trudeau established the National Energy Program, which, if you mention in Western Canada, is equivalent to yelling expletives. Reason being, the National Energy Program gave control of petroleum prices to the federal government, and the federal government put a tax on exporting oil and used it to subsidize the import of oil. So, for example, Alberta couldn't sell anything because their oil was no longer cheaper than world price, and the East was able to import foreign oil, not Alberta oil, for cheaper than world price. This notably pissed off Alberta since they couldn't sell their oil and everyone else got cheap oil at their expense. So the National Energy Program was scrapped, with Trudeau literally not getting a single seat between British Columbia and Manitoba. Natural gas is third, and there's nothing new. Basically, it's been regulated the same way petroleum has, which is to say it basically hasn't been regulated. Sale within Canada is promoted, but due to the nature of Canada's free trade agreements, and we have a lot of them, it can be freely traded across borders. Electricity. Electric power generation relies on hydroelectric power, which Canada does well, what with there being the whole Niagara Falls thing making energy by falling. Nuclear. Nuclear power plants exist in Canada, mostly in Ontario. They rely on uranium, and they're not terrible to the environment, and they're not terrible economically. Unfortunately, however, most of the nuclear power plants in Ontario have time expired or are too stressed, so they have either to be renewed or replaced. Replaced by what? Well, one option is renewables. The three basic renewables are hydro, solar, and wind. We talked about hydro, and it's renewable because it uses the movement of water without consuming the water. Solar power should be huge, and there are policies, especially by Ontario, to promote private ownership of solar panels. Canada is pretty big, so it gets a lot of sun, and it's taken a lot of heat, no pun intended, for not using the impeccable land space to install solar panels. Wind energy production is pretty big on the coast, where there is a lot of wind. There's a bunch of wind farms in Canada providing about 2.3% of Canada's electricity demand. One thing that I won't get a chance to mention in another video is science and research, so I'll include it in this one. Historically, the Canadian government has supported research in all of the fields, with 10 Canadian Nobel laureates. Canada's newest observatory, unfortunately, was built in 1978, and budgets haven't supported research recently as often as in the past. Government research grants and government research facilities have both been cut in the last few years. And get this, the current Canadian government completely scrapped this thing called the National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy. It was an independent policy advisory board, and it based on scientific reports the fact that Canada should install a carbon tax. This is one of the many travesties committed by the current government. Others including cutting the experimental lakes area funding entirely. It was a project to produce critical evidence to help stop acid rain, building a strictly resource-based economy, which is terrible since if the resources run out the economy is empty, and even if it doesn't, only specific regions benefit. Gutting the Fisheries Act, which protects freshwater and sea habitats, emptying environmental assessment from being significant, making it easy for corporations to exploit Canadian land and resources, cutting the budget for Environment Canada, gutting the Navigable Waterways Act to simplify exploitation of water, and decreasing the list of protected waterways from about 10,000 to about 150. And the fact that you can't remember what I said at the beginning of the sentence shows you how competent this government is. Altogether, all of these programs cost less than 0.5% of Canada's total budget, yet the Canadian federal government saw it fit to do this to science and the environment in this country. That's not even to begin to criticize Mr. Harper's government on things relevant to the last three videos, like the fact that foreign aid is going towards helping Canadian mining companies exploit other countries' natural resources rather than actually helping fight poverty. Like the fact that these supposed fiscal conservatives, in cutting the experimental lakes area, actually have to spend more to close it than they would to run it for 25 years. Like the fact that the Senate has a higher percentage of violent criminals than Canada at large does. Like the fact that this government wants to seem tough on crime by focusing on punishment and not even considering treatment or prevention. In conclusion, Internet, I'm telling you in this video that I simply disagree with just about every policy of this government. I'm not going to support any party in these videos, but I'll criticize every party that screws up. I'll be outlining specific party policies in coming videos, especially if they stand out, and maybe I'll do a video on each party at some point. To end the video on a lighter note, there's a link in the description to a legitimate debate in the House of Commons about the viability of Canada against the zombie invasion. Now, I hope you've learned something today, and if you have any questions, leave them in the comments. Let me know what you think, and thank you for watching. I'll see you next week.